In addition to its structure, an organization's culture and climate are important aspects of context that should be taken into consideration when interpreting the results of studies that have been conducted in that particular setting. Not to mention, cultural factors and considering the current climate are also important factors that should be considered when making any type of administrative decision. As Peterson and Spencer discussed, culture and climate has long been of interest to scholars studying organizations outside of higher ed. But over the past 30 years, there's been a lot more attention given to how these concepts are important within colleges and universities. Both are critical aspects of a school's internal environment, but they're tougher to collect data on than structure. So in this presentation, I'm going to supplement the readings by giving you my perspective on how culture and climate could be relevant to your action research dissertation, as well as to planning and decision-making of post-secondary leaders more broadly. But this is just my 2 cents, so be thinking about other applications besides what I suggest. Peterson and Spencer gave a lot of attention to defining culture and climate in their chapter. So I'm not going to spend as much time on that, but I'm just going to highlight the distinctions and interrelationships between the two ideas. So first of all, basically, how is climate defined? I'm drawing from a more recent definition proposed by Lawrence and McNaughton, but basically it reflects how Peterson and Spencer defined climate as well. So basically, organizational climate can be thought of as the perceptions of any given institution of different constituents, different stakeholders, that they develop through their interactions within that environment as they strive to interpret events. So basically, it's capturing their attitudes and behaviors, as Peterson and Spencer noted. So organizational climate research basically encompasses several branches of inquiries into people's perceptions of their environments. So most broadly speaking, the focus of climate research is on the cognitive representations of different organizational conditions. So goals, policies, practices, procedures, processes that individuals use to construct and guide their behavior. So consequently, it makes sense that multiple climates may exist within any given single organization. So certain individuals can perceive the climate differently depending on their perspective, and oftentimes different subgroups will perceive the campus climate differently as well. Culture, on the other hand, is an organizational characteristic, basically a view of reality that is embedded in a kind of collective consciousness that exists separately from individual perceptions. So to get at some more formal definitions of culture up on the screen, so again, drawing from another source, George Koo and Elizabeth Witt, who wrote about culture, they saw it as specific to higher education, persistent patterns of norms, values, practices, beliefs, and assumptions that shape individual and group behavior within a post-secondary setting, and they provide a common frame of reference within which to interpret meaning of events and actions on and off campus. So really getting at what Peterson and Spencer also referred to, culture is basically the collective values, beliefs, and meaning that organizational members prescribe to that organization, essentially the glue that holds the organization together, while climate is more fluctuating and gets at attitudes and behaviors. So while culture is conceptually similar to climate, the two are sometimes conflated, so be careful not to, because they're actually theoretically distinct, as hopefully the readings and this presentation are making clear. But also, what's complicated, as Peterson and Spencer noted, whether culture and climate are two separate ways to understand the same phenomenon within an organization, or whether they're definitions of totally different phenomena, is something that scholars have not yet come to consensus on. But regardless, both organizational climate and culture help people to make sense of their environments. The important thing is that culture evolves slowly, and it's based on a known history of considerable duration. And then climate forms more rapidly, and it's in response to situational contingencies, such as changes in personnel, finances, or policies. And importantly, again, culture is really an enduring organizational characteristic. Again, it's like glue that holds organizations, different components together. So these concepts can be kind of complicated and difficult to think about in practice, but I think they're actually really, really useful for administrators in higher education and critical actually in order to be a successful leader. So I want to reflect a bit in terms of my opinions about how the concepts of both culture and climate and researching culture and climate can be really useful to administrative practice and decision making. But again, please think in terms of your own practice and your own setting as I'm discussing this in terms of how these ideas might be useful to help you better improve your decision making. So first, I'm going to discuss my opinions about climate. Campus climate and understanding of campus climate can be really useful for diagnosing issues on campus. So rather than relying on one or two people's anecdotes, studies of climate can offer a more systematic understanding of what's currently happening on campus related to different important topics. And campus climate studies can also be useful for accreditation purposes. So just to discuss a little bit more about studies of climate, so it can be studied either qualitatively or quantitatively. Today, universities commonly conduct quantitative climate surveys. And actually the best practice advocated by a number of professional associations, agencies, and scholars is to actually conduct climate surveys about once every 3 years. So a one-time survey isn't really that useful. It's more helpful to do longitudinal studies. So you establish a benchmark with your first climate survey, and you really don't know whether it's improving or getting worse until you continue to do follow-up surveys and see how the climate changes over time. So Peterson and Spencer summarized some of the topics that climate studies focused on in the 60s and 70s. Today, most commonly, campuses do a number of climate surveys related to issues related to sexual misconduct, as well as diversity and inclusion. So up on the screen is actually 2 websites to different best practice examples of climate surveys around those particular topics. So the first, related to sexual misconduct, is actually a survey that both the White House Task Force and the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights have identified as a best practice to better understand the extent and nature of sexual assault on campuses, as well as attitudes surrounding sexual assault, which can then help administrators and students to direct resources where they're most needed. So if that's an area in which, or topic in which you're interested, I highly encourage you to check out the survey instrument that is up on that website. And then, related to questions of campus diversity and campus inclusion, the Higher Education Research Institute at UCLA, which you read about a few modules ago in the chapter that discussed national data sets and secondary data sets, they have a number of different surveys that they conduct on different college campuses and universities. One in particular is called the Diverse Learning Environments Survey. So essentially this survey is used by institutions to evaluate the campus climate particular to diversity, experiences with discrimination, cross-racial interactions, and sense of belonging. So that survey itself is about institutional climate in general, but they also have a module specifically focused on perceptions of diversity within the classroom environment, as well as one particular to the climate for transfer students. So I highly encourage you, if your interests are related to campus diversity and inclusion, to check out the survey instrument that Harry has. It's available online. You can view it online at that website. And then in addition, so this is a little bit of a self-serving plug, but a few years ago, actually about 10, 12 years ago now, I was part of a project that was sponsored by the American Association of Colleges and Universities to study the campus climates around personal and social responsibility. Essentially, the AAC&U was interested in different values, personal values that are evident on campuses and where campuses need to better improve around students, faculty, and staff personal and social responsibility. So the website to those survey instruments is right there on the screen. And so if you're interested in that kind of topic, I also highly encourage you to check out that campus climate instrument. So essentially, To sum up, there are a lot of different topics that can be studied vis-a-vis campus climate, but what's really important is to be able to collect those data, not just as a one-time thing, but do regular follow-ups every couple of years to see how the campus climate is changing and hopefully improving around different issues. And it really can help advise or help administrators to make sense of what kinds of resources and programs they should be creating and supporting and modifying based on what the campus climate looks like. Now on to climate. So I think Tierney's suggestions about why college and university leaders must understand their organization's culture are really well made. So sometimes the most sincere, earnest plans or initiatives get waylaid by disregarding culture. So resulting in leaders frequently being, as Tierney says, always in crisis management mode or even in votes of no confidence or termination, all because they don't think the existing culture is very important and or they can disregard it. So in terms of applying these ideas to your own professional practice, the dimensions that Tierney suggests that administrators consider to better understand culture, as he applied to the Family State College case study, are great. And they're up here on the screen, as well as obviously you saw them in his article. So although it's not required as a graded assignment for this module, I'd really encourage you to apply these ideas to your own organization, be it your department or your larger institution. So basically be an amateur anthropologist. Talk to your colleagues about their impressions of what the culture looks like in terms of the environment, the mission, socialization. So several questions for each of those dimensions are proposed by Tierney. And then also information and relative access to information on campus, which is a very important resource, right? And then how organizational strategy is formed and how decisions are made. And then also in terms of leadership. What adjectives would they use to characterize the overall culture? To what extent are their impressions shared with one another and also with what you perceive? So I've actually done this at my own campus, my own university, Arizona State, which is a very interesting example in a strong culture around President Crow's New American University model that you read about a few weeks ago. And it's really symbolized physically by signs all over campus with the phrase and with his design aspirations, as well as it permeates the discussions that our faculty, students, and staff have around our strategies, our agendas, and how our work fits in the larger institutional mission. And if you go to even ASU's President's Office website, it's very clear in terms of what those values are. And also in these conversations I've had with my colleagues about the institutional culture, it really is very salient and shared across all of our organizational members. We really do have this shared sense of meaning around the New American University model and its design aspirations. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse, but everyone who I have met has a very strong understanding of what ASU's organizational culture looks like. So I really encourage you to kind of engage in that investigation in your own setting of practice. And now, in conclusion, I just want to give you my perspective on how I think the concepts of culture and climate can be useful to you within the context of your action research dissertation study, and really any action research that you might engage in within a professional setting. So I would argue that it's critical for leaders in colleges and universities, as well as any organization, to understand their culture and climate when implementing interventions, innovations, new programs, policies, practices, etc., in order to ensure that those changes are consistent with the larger institutional identity and organizational members' sense of what should be happening and what is acceptable within that particular organization. So one thing that I think is especially helpful, in addition to Bill Tierney's framework, is this heuristic that the American Association of Colleges and Universities propose, these different dimensions of campus culture. So are there ways in which your institution's mission and its purpose could be creating a barrier to implementing your innovation? Or perhaps ways in which your institution's leadership might create some sort of backlash against your project? Or are there particular policies and procedures in place that might run counter to your innovation? Same thing for each of these different dimensions. So regarding both things that are happening in and out of the classroom, as well as related to relationships with the community, relationships with internal stakeholders, different traditional activities and organizations that exist, as well as the different systems in place around reward and assessment. All of those different markers or those different dimensions, depending on how they reflect the campus culture, could create barriers for your idea for an innovation related to your dissertation. And so I really encourage you to consider how all of these different dimensions might create potential cultural barriers, but then also how organizational climate and culture come into play in your actual implementation might be something you could return to in your dissertation discussion and conclusion section as well. So although there isn't a formal assignment associated with these different concepts in this particular course, they are really valuable considerations for conducting research, implementing new programs and practices, and overall institutional leadership. So I really encourage you to think carefully and critically about how climate and culture are important not just to your EDD work, but then also to your professional practice in general.